you agreed upon your verdict?
We are.
And do you find the prisoner guilty or not guilty of murder?
Guilty.
And that is the verdict of you all?
Yes.
Prisoner at the bar, you stand convicted of murder. Have you anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon you?
Oh yea, oh yea, oh yea. My lords, the King's justices do strictly charge and command all persons to keep silence whilst sentence of death is passed upon the prisoner at the bar upon pain of imprisonment. God save the King.
Prisoner at the bar, you stand convicted of murder. The sentence of the court upon you is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that you be there hanged by the neck until you be dead, and that your body be afterwards buried within the precincts of the prison in which you shall have been confined before your execution. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul.
3 generations, the Pierpoints, Henry, his brother Thomas, and Henry's son Albert, served as official executioners for the Crown, presiding over hundreds of state-sanctioned deaths. This is not a chronicle of executions or a macabre tally of the condemned. It is a story of a family who chose a profession most of us could never understand. They lived among their neighbours as grocers, carriers, quarrymen, husbands and fathers, but in their occasional absences, they became the final presence in a stranger's life. Henry Pierpoint, also known as Harry, was born in Normanton-on-Soar, Nottinghamshire, in 1878 to Thomas and Anne Pierpoint, who ran the King's Head pub in East Leek. Soon after Henry was born, the family moved to Clayton, a town near Bradford in Yorkshire, where his father had found work in the quarries, caring for horses. This was around 1891. As a teenager, Harry worked at a Worstead mill, producing yarn and cloth. And it was around this time he had started reading about James Berry, a famous Bradford executioner, whose career as a leading hangman in the country ended in disgrace after several failed executions. His interest now piqued, he now became intrigued and wanted to know more. For years he read about the exploits of hangmen in the newspapers, paying particular attention to James Billington, the Home Office No. 1 hangman, from 1884 to 1901. He carried out 151 hangings in total, executing 141 men and 5 women in England and Wales, plus 2 men in Ireland and 3 men in Scotland. He was also the hangman responsible for executing Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, the serial killer who poisoned at least 10 victims and whose alleged final words of "I'm Jack the" were tantalizingly cut short by Billington's noose, and it left a teasing possible conclusion to the mystery of who Jack the Ripper was, which wasn't true, as the official records show that Cream was incarcerated in Illinois during the Ripper murders. For Henry Harry Pierpoint, the idea of becoming an executioner who travelled the country became his life's goal. In Albert's words, his father believed he was chosen by a higher power to carry out this duty. Albert recalled his father taking him out for the day, and with pride his father told his friends that Albert, his eldest son, would one day become an official executioner. Looking at his father's smiling moustached face, Albert asked if he could finally wear long trousers. With this day imprinted in his mind, it solidified his direction in life. Not happy with his job at the mill, his father got him an apprenticeship as a butcher in Bradford. After about 3 years, he decided he'd had enough, so at the age of 18, moved to Manchester, where he began work with the cabinet maker firm his sister worked for. While there, he would meet his future bride, Mary Buxton, and they married in 1898. They settled into married life and went on to have 5 children. They were a happy family most of the time. They did, however, like many in those days, have some tough times. Harry Pierpoint didn't give up on his other chosen career path. He just didn't mention it to those around him. Just before Harry's 23rd birthday, not 24, as it's been stated, as it's clear his birthday is March 1878, but it's believed he added some years on for his application. He was now married with one daughter, and he decided it was time to try to apply to the Home Secretary, Mr. Ridley, for the position of executioner. It went as follows. I wish to inform you that I should be very thankful if you would accept me as one of your public executioners, should at any time Mr. Billington's time expires, as I have always had a desire for that appointment. My age is 24, and I am strong in build and health. Height 5 foot 8.5 inches. Should you require any particulars of my character, I shall be glad to give you all the information you require. Hoping the application will be of no offence, Mr. Henry H. Pierpoint. To Harry's absolute delight, he was granted an interview at Strangeways in Manchester. But after a misunderstanding, Harry was turned away. After contacting the governor, Mr. Cruikshank, Harry was given another interview. The interview went well, and the governor accepted him for the job, telling him he now needed to complete a fortnight's training course. The Pierpoints were still a very young family with only one child, and Harry had just told his wife about his secret career passion. At first she was shocked and begged him not to pursue it, but she understood how much it mattered to him. Even though she couldn't agree with the idea of taking a life, she let him follow his own path, and another wage coming in was going to be helpful. It was the beginning of the Pierpoint name becoming one of the most prominent names in British criminology. Henry began his travels and made his way to London, Newgate Prison to be precise, to begin his training on Monday the 11th of March 1901. On arrival he was shown to his room, which he would come to learn was the hangman's room. The grim, dark attic room he would get to know very well in many different prisons. The first day was filled with an opportunity to look around the prison and see a little more of the city. This was followed by some lectures about his duties from the warden. A sleepless night was followed by day 2, where he was to carry out a dummy execution from start to end. He was shown around the execution chamber and then spent time learning how the traps opened and reset on the scaffold. The duties of the executioner were explained to him, and he spent hours familiarizing himself with the ropes, chains and noose, paying particular attention to the measurement instructions for the drop. He would go on to recall, I was taken to the condemned cell, and there in a dark corner the victim was pointed out to me. I advanced to pinion him, as I had been instructed, and my heart did some heavy thumping when I found that the condemned man was a stuffed dummy with a hideously grinning face and right hand up saluting me. I never expected this. I thought it was one of the warders, whom I should have to practice on, and no doubt the real nature of the victim was purposely kept from me to test my nerves. But if they expected me to flinch, they were disappointed. I had had a shock, but I also had the sense not to show it. So I pinioned the dummy, carried it to the scaffold, and hanged it just as though it had been the real man. He repeated this process over the next 10 days, recalculating the drops for a change of weight, and increased his speed. After an oral test and a final snap dummy execution, he was sent home with the knowledge that detectives would be delving into his character and private affairs, although this had already started the moment the Home Office received his letter. So with a new vigour in his step, Harry went home and waited, and waited, and waited for 6 months until a letter arrived from Governor Cruikshank asking him to assist in an execution on May the 18th, 1901, of a man who had taken the life of his wife. Harry happily agreed, only to receive another letter a week later informing him there was to be no execution, as the man had been offered a reprieve. Harry would later say that he was content with the thought that he had been prevented from helping an innocent man hang. Henry's first commission was at the old Newgate prison, where he was to assist the man he had admired for some time, James Billington, at the execution of French anarchist and murderer Marcel Fougeron on the 19th of November 1901. After Henry and Billington had inspected the apparatus, and Henry had been allowed to attach the sandbag that was to match the age, weight, and general condition of the prisoner to the noose, this was done before every execution to stretch out the rope. Billington then rigged the drop, and once he felt all was in order, he carried out the drop test in front of the governor. The rope was left to stretch overnight. When everyone left the chamber, a prison guard stayed outside the room to make sure the apparatus wasn't tampered with. Harry and Billington went straight to their rooms. Billington spent the night before in the attic room known as the hangman's room, while Harry spent the night before sleeping in the spare condemned cell next to the Frenchman. While looking around the room, he spotted a peephole that looked into the next cell. Henry watched as the condemned man paced all night. Henry knew Billington had already worked out the drop from the man's height, weight, and estimated neck strength. But Henry wanted to learn and began his own estimations in his mind. The next morning, the hangman returned to the chamber. Billington pulled up the rope and adjusted the drop to account for the stretch, while Henry went underneath to close the heavy drop doors and secured them before setting the lever. At 2 minutes to 8, they entered the cell. Fougeron's arms were pinioned behind his back. With warders by his side, they marched him to the execution chamber. The white cap placed over his head, then the noose. Harry quickly placed the leather straps around the prisoner's ankles and just as quickly moved to the side. Billington, without hesitation, pushed the lever. The trapdoor opened and he fell to his death. The body would now hang for an hour before being removed. The removal of the body was also the duty of the executioner. Once removed, they placed the body in a wooden coffin. They then dismantled the ropes and chains and placed them in a heavy padlocked trunk. Harry had kept his nerve. He hadn't faltered. He felt no fear. And a week later, he received a letter from the Home Office confirming his name had now been added to the Home Office list of approved executioners. This was the first of 849 executions the Pierpoints would be involved with. In Harry's first 15 months, he was involved in 15 hangings, either as assistant or as a main executioner. Before James Billington died, Harry assisted him in his last execution on the 3rd of December 1901. It was clear to Harry that the man wasn't well. In fact, James had been bedridden for a couple of weeks before this and was suffering with bronchitis. But he was determined to see this through, as he knew the prisoner quite well and wanted to make sure he had a dignified and speedy death. And that he did. James Billington died in 1901, and tragically, his oldest son, Thomas, died a few weeks later. William and John carried on their occupation until 1905. John died of pleurisy that year, but William would be removed from the list of official executioners after he was sentenced to serve 1 month in Wakefield jail for failing to maintain his wife and their 2 children, who ended up being admitted to a workhouse in Bolton because of debt and poverty. In March 1902, Harry received a letter asking him if he was available to act as chief executioner at Richard Wigley's hanging on March the 18th at Shrewsbury Prison. Henry replied yes, he was. The only 2 executioners available at that time were Harry and John Ellis. Although both were qualified to take on the job of executioner, Harry was the more senior by only a fortnight, so it was Harry that was chosen for the job, with Ellis as his assistant. Harry went on that year to assist William Billington on a number of executions. Many described his approach as emotionless but methodical. He recorded each hanging in his diary. His methods were precise and quick, carefully measuring the drop to ensure the process went smoothly and without mistakes. But Harry would, on occasion, put into words how he felt. When 32-year-old Henry Williams returned home from the Boer War, he discovered his wife had been unfaithful to him. So he slit the throat of his 5-year-old daughter, Margaret, at their home and covered her body with the Union Jack flag. When asked why he'd done such a terrible thing, he said he didn't want her to grow up to be like her mother. After the execution at Pentonville, while assisting William Billington, Henry wrote in his diary that he was the bravest man he had ever hanged. He had accepted his actions. He sought no reprieve. He stood erect on the trap. He wanted to die. In February 1903, Harry was involved with one of the most alarming cases that filled the newspapers of the time, when along with William and John Billington, he was asked to assist in a double hanging at Holloway Prison, that of 2 women, Amelia Satch, 29, and Annie Walters, 54, both claiming to be nurses, who were convicted at the Old Bailey for the murder of a young child. It later emerged that they might have been responsible for many more child deaths. They became known as the Finchley baby farmers. 1903 seemed a busy year. 1904 quickly approached, but it was a slow start for Harry, with his first job coming on the 29th of March. By May, he had decided to leave the job at the cabinet makers and moved back to Clayfield in Bradford. He now began his own carrier business, transporting goods from the local railway station. He was assigned to carry out executions only as an assistant to William Billington. Even when William was unavailable, his brother John took the lead. This made a big financial difference, especially since he now had his own business and a 3rd child on the way. The pay gap between chief hangman and assistant hangman was quite substantial. The year moved on with more assistant jobs, and in 1905, on the 28th of February, just days before his 3rd child was due, Harry travelled to London to assist John Billington. This was when William Billington was having problems involving the courts. Although William did one more execution when all the other hangmen were engaged elsewhere, they brought him out of forced retirement for one last time. In 1905, while William spent time in prison, they were literally only 3 hangmen, compared to when Harry joined in 1901, there were 8. In August 1905, there were 2 executions scheduled for the same day. Harry and Ellis were engaged on the Devereux case, and nobody was available to help John Billington hang Thomas Tattersall in Leeds. So they had no choice but to turn to William Warbrick. He had only assisted at one hanging a year earlier, and for some reason had not been invited back. While Billington was on the scaffolding, he stepped back and fell through the open trapdoors into the pit below. He suffered cracked ribs, but managed to see the execution through to the end. A few weeks later, John Billington died at home from pleurisy. It's believed brought on by the fall. From this moment on, Harry Pierpoint was the #1 hangman in the country, with only him and Ellis left. The next few months were busy, but December was the busiest time they had ever experienced. Harry's brother Thomas Pierpoint, who was 7 years older than him, was at the time working as a quarryman and helped with the carrier business Harry had started. Harry, knowing of the shortage of executioners, asked his brother to join him. So Thomas was taken under his younger brother's wing and began training him using rope and bags of corn in the stable at the back of the cottage. After Harry had convinced Tom to apply to the Home Office to be placed on the list of executioners, he was accepted for the training course. He was practically fully trained already. When he was sent for training at Pentonville, he literally only did half the time, as it was apparent to the prison engineer that Harry had obviously trained him already. Thomas joined his brother on the Home Office list. Tom's first commission was to assist his brother Harry on Monday the 9th of April 1906 for the execution of Harry Walters at Wakefield. After some sporadic dry months through 1907 and 1908, the 2 brothers worked together on many executions, as well as Harry working alone. Harry had been asked if he was free to officiate at an execution on May the 12th, 1908, of John Ramsbottom for the murder of James McCraw at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. He agreed and was paired with Ellis. for the first time in a year. Now, it's possible that jealousy had started around then. Ellis had been working as an executioner, which cut into Harry's earnings as the top executioner. But from Ellis's perspective, Harry's brother was also taking jobs from him as an assistant. This had created some tension between the two. But despite that, they continued to work together on several occasions after. 1909 was to be Harry's busiest time ever as a hangman. Week after week he was travelling across the country. Towards the last week of the year, he carried out 3 executions in the space of 7 days. And on the 14th of December, he, assisted by Thomas, hanged Samuel Atherley at Bagthorpe Prison, Nottingham. 1910 came around, and as we now know, it would be Harry's last year as hangman. Harry Pierpoint's name was now out as the hangman, and had been out for some time, but he had managed to stay pretty anonymous. He had also been working with Ellis quite a lot, but their relationship wasn't as it used to be. They were quite cold towards each other now. Harry had always been a man for his drink, as Albert would go on to confirm in his book. With the extra money coming in, Harry was quite happy to spend hours with his drinking buddies. It wasn't something new, he'd been like this for years. He was a much-loved family man, brother and husband, but obviously had his faults. But not once had it interfered in his work as an executioner. In March 1910, the execution of former soldier George H. Perry at Pentonville marked Harry Pierpoint's 100th execution. One afternoon in 1910, the day before an execution, Harry arrived as usual at Chelmsford Prison. He didn't seem himself. In fact, files now released say Harry was considerably worse for drink and had got into a fight with John Ellis, his assistant, who he met at the gatehouse that afternoon. According to the chief warder, as his officers were handing over the prisoner's details, Pierpoint suddenly opened a volley of abuse at his assistant, John Ellis, who had taken out his book to write down the details. After the warder had separated the 2 men, Harry went about his business, preparing the apparatus for the next day. After the execution that went, according to the newspapers, exceptionally well, the 2 men went their separate ways and returned home. Ellis wrote to the prison commissioners at the Home Office. It went. He rushed at me and knocked me out of the chair I was sat on. I got up but was knocked off again. He was going for me again when Warder Nash, who had heard the noise, came in and attempted to stop him but failed, and the blow struck me behind the ear, and it apparently struck him a few more times. Ellis claimed that he had advised Pierpoint to drink less, as it gave the public the impression he had to drink to do his work. Even though the execution the following day was carried out with the most extraordinary dispatch, a letter was sent to Chelmsford Prison to get the warder's account on the matter. They confirmed what had been said by Ellis. A week later, the following memo was distributed to all sheriffs, telling them that Pierpoint's name had been removed from the official list of executioners. The letter dated the 2nd of July 1910. Dear Sir, I am directed by the Secretary of State to inform you that he has felt it his duty to order the name of H. A. Pierpoint to be removed by the prison commissioners from the list of persons who have been found to be qualified to act as executioners. Mr. Churchill is informed that when Mr. Pierpoint was last employed, he arrived at the prison on the day before the execution in a drunken and quarrelsome state, that he made use of bad language and assaulted his assistant. He would therefore be glad if you would note that Pierpoint should not be employed on any future occasion to act as executioner. E. Blackwell. According to all accounts, Harry was never officially told, and in 1911 he wrote to Churchill asking for his job back, claiming Ellis had been after his job for some time, and this was an orchestrated act to get it. He basically stated that some people in a pub that both he and Ellis frequented in Manchester told him that Ellis had been showing people some written information regarding Harry. Harry tried to explain he didn't believe it at first, but when a very trusted friend mentioned it, he was annoyed. He went on to explain that when he next saw Ellis, his anger overtook him and he confronted Ellis. He then claimed Ellis had been saying for a long time that he was going to report him for anything he could. Harry went on to claim that he could have reported Ellis many times, but didn't because he wasn't the sort of person to do that. He also went on to state he had never had any problem with any sheriff, and his work has always been classed as professional and exceptional. He asked for them to please take into account that he had a family of 5 to look after, and to please reconsider his termination from the list, as he was only defending his position. Harry didn't receive a reply. Thomas became aware that something had happened when he was asked to act as chief executioner at Leeds, and most of this news was drowned out in the newspapers by the sensational news surrounding Crippen at the time. Harry and Thomas would never forgive Ellis for this. Between 1901 and 1910, according to the Home Office list, Harry assisted at 35 hangings and carried out 70 executions as principal. 63 in England and Wales, 4 in Ireland, 2 in Scotland and 1 in Jersey, during his 9-year term of office. Harry Pierpoint kept a detailed diary of every execution. He recorded everything from the journey to the scaffold to the payment he received. He noted the weights used for drop lengths and all the measurements of the prisoner in the condemned cell. The diary had every detail. It even included the birth dates of his children. Although Thomas remained professional, there was no doubt he did not like Ellis. They were now down to 3 executioners, Thomas, Ellis and Wallace, and most of them had always been assistants, with Ellis only having been number 1 executioner on 5 occasions, so they brought William Warbrick out of retirement. Ellis was now number 1, and by the end of 1911, Tom was also a number 1. The prison commissioners now took on more trainee executioners. The quiet, unspoken ban on Harry's career around his children slowly became clear to a young Albert, as he learned about his father's work by reading the serialized stories in the newspapers when he was a very young boy. Henry might have been a controlled executioner, but at home he was a devoted father and husband. While he wasn't perfect in either role, his family loved him. He shared amazing stories with his children, and he did his best to keep them healthy, warm and fed. Money was often scarce. His wife sometimes wondered if the money he earned was reaching her or if it was going to the bartender. His friends had no problem calling him over for stories and drinks. But she was a strong woman and she was smart, and she knew exactly how to handle Harry Pierpoint. They were a close family. Harry had started the carrier business in Clayton and Bradford, then passed it on to his older brother Thomas. Thomas preferred a quieter life, running the business in Clayton with his wife, running a small shop. When Albert was growing up, he saw Clayton as paradise. Whenever he visited his Uncle Tom and Aunt Lizzie, they had chickens, horses and a donkey. Albert got to help his uncle with the horses and even drive the cart when it was safe. All the children enjoyed their time there, running, playing and eating large meals that Aunt Lizzie always piled on their plates. And occasionally, just like his father, Uncle Tom would have to go away for a bit. Angry but determined, Harry continued his work at Huddersfield Gasworks, where the family had moved to years before, and Albert's mum had been working in a munitions factory when the war started. In 1916, the Thompson's Weekly News ran a story every week for months titled My 10 Years Experiences of Henry A. Pierpoint, Retired Executioner. This was how 11-year-old Albert learned why his father had sometimes been absent from home. The family moved again to Failsworth near Manchester, but Harry was going to stay in Huddersfield for his work at Hopkins Ironworks and came home every weekend. Eventually, after an accident at work, it left Harry unemployed for some time, and he returned to the family home. Even though he was a very sick man, he got another job at Mather and Platt's Engineers. The family faced tough times. Albert was working full-time at a mill, and as a teenager he wanted to buy himself some football boots. But money was tight, and by the end of the summer 1922, Harry had become too sick and too weak to work. Things were worse than ever. He decided to rewrite his memoirs and sell them to another paper, Reynolds News. Albert, still working at the mill, gave his father a shilling to buy notebooks for writing. The stories ran over 3 months, with the last instalment published just before 45-year-old Henry Harry Pierpoint died on December the 14th, 1922. And while grieving heavily for his father, Albert held on to his father's diary, which he would study intently. Thomas Pierpoint was also born in Nottingham on the 6th of October 1870, 7 years before Henry. When they later moved to Clayton, he worked alongside his father in the quarry as a stone quarryman. He met and married Elizabeth Binns in Bradford on the 5th of December 1891. Thomas had been encouraged by Harry to apply to the Home Office for the position as an executioner, and while waiting for a reply, Harry trained Tom in the barn at the back of his home. He trained him so well that he didn't need to finish the full training course, and in 1906 began working as a hangman and assisted his brother at many hangings. After Harry Pierpoint was removed from the list, it became clear to Thomas that they were short of executioners. This became evident when he was asked to act as chief executioner at Leeds on August 9, 1910, for John Coulson, who had killed his wife and 5-year-old child. They even had to bring William Warbrick out of retirement. Thomas realised that his brother was no longer on the list. Although 1911 was a slow year for Thomas, he had assisted with a couple of hangings with Ellis. Thomas remained professional and kept his feelings towards Ellis to himself, and by the end of the year he was also a number 1 executioner. On the 17th of April 1912, Thomas was commissioned as assistant to Ellis to hang Frederick Seddon at Pentonville for the murder of Eliza Mary Barrow. By 1914 he had taken on the carrier business from Henry. People who knew him remember him only as a kindly older gentleman, quietly spoken and with a good sense of humour. He lived quietly at his cottage in Clayton, where his wife Lizzie had the shop. He kept mules and chickens and goats, and also ran the haulage firm and a bookmaking business. Occasionally he would disappear for a couple of days without saying much to anyone. He seemed like a quiet, simple man, and was very much admired by young Albert. There weren't many commissions for Thomas that year either, and in the first half of 1915 there wasn't any commission for Thomas or Ellis until 23-year-old Robert Rosenthal was convicted of treason after being caught on his way to pass secrets of naval information to his German contacts. This was Thomas's first execution for treason, and he had a new assistant, Robert Baxter. The trial and execution was held in secret, so the enemy didn't know of his arrest and conviction. He was the only spy to be hanged during the First World War. 11 others were shot in the Tower. The years passed, with Thomas continuing his commission work for the Home Office and keeping the carrier business going back home in Clayton. His part-time work kept him busy most of the time, with some lapses from time to time. Ellis resigned in March 1924 due to stress and illness, and with Ellis gone, Thomas took on more work as the number 1 executioner. Willis replaced Ellis, and Baxter was promoted to executioner. One day while home, Thomas read in the newspaper that John Ellis had tried to take his own life, but not before he'd tried to take the life of his whole family. Thankfully, his family were okay. According to Albert's account, Thomas had replied, "He should have done it years ago. It was impossible to work with him." Ellis was charged with attempting to take his own life, and at court the judge spoke to him and told him how disappointed he was to see him there, and asked him to promise not to try and do this again and give up drinking before dismissing him from the court. Ellis would succeed on his second attempt 8 years later. Home life with Thomas Pierpoint was a slow pace. His wife ran her shop and he looked after the animals. He'd carrier work and looked after his bookmaking business. But he had now begun training some friends in the very same place his brother had trained him. Thomas was allowed to choose his own assistant, so he would be able to take his friends as his assistants instead of using those who were on the official list. Because if he used those on that list, he would be recorded in official circles and could eventually take potential jobs away from him. All the friends he used went under the name Robinson and were not on the official list, so he could pay them and not worry about losing future work. Albert spent as much time as he could with his aunt and uncle in Clayton, especially after his father had passed. He was so close with them, and when Uncle Tom would have to leave, it wasn't discussed, because it never was. But Aunt Liz would wait until he'd gone and say, "You know where he's gone, don't you?" before giving Albert a good gossip about life in Clayton. At the beginning of 1930, a referendum was carried out on capital punishment between those that wanted to keep it as a deterrent and those that wanted it abolished. Recent cases were reviewed to support both sides, and the Labour Home Secretary, J.R. Clines, an active believer in the abolition of capital punishment, sanctioned a number of reprieves. The report suggested suspending the death penalty for a 5-year trial period. However, the Conservatives did not agree and refused to sign it. Since no amended bill was introduced, the proposal was effectively defeated. When Thomas Pierpoint was asked his opinion on the matter, he said he didn't believe murderers should be nursed in prison for the rest of their lives. But it didn't matter to him either way. But behind closed doors, he wasn't happy about it. On the 19th of April 1931, Tom's nephew Albert had written a letter to the Home Secretary. "Dear Sir, I beg to offer you my services as an assistant executioner to my uncle, T. W. Pierpoint, at any time he or any other retire from their position. My age is 26 and I am strong in health and build. During the last few years I have thoroughly studied out the carrying out of an execution and the calculating of drops, etc., learned from the diary of my late father, Mr. H. A. Pierpoint. Hoping this letter will meet your kind approval, I am, dear sir, your obedient servant, Albert Pierpoint, 41 Mill Street, Failsworth, Manchester." Unfortunately for Albert, he was turned down, being told there were no vacancies for executioners at the moment. He was so disappointed, and his mother, who had seen the envelope and through experience with her husband knew who it was from, asked her son if he was trying to get his father's job. He replied he was, and she implored him not to go down that route. Albert had a new job, a good job that paid reasonably well. He was driving for a grocer's and felt honoured that he could drive. Albert, although thoroughly disappointed about being turned down, decided to just knuckle down and get on with his job. Until one day, 12 months later, a long buff envelope arrived on the doormat. His mother picked it up and saw the letters OHMS. She knew exactly what it was, sighed, and placed it on the mantelpiece. Albert arrived home that evening from work and with his heart racing opened the letter. It said there now existed a vacancy on the list that he had applied to join, and if he was still interested to confirm it by writing to the Governor of Strangeways. His mother was disappointed. She didn't want her son to go down the same road her husband had. But Albert knew it was what he wanted to do, and he knew his dad would be proud of him. He also knew he wasn't his father. He responded to the letter and was offered an appointment 2 weeks later. His interview, he thought, went reasonably well, but as the weeks passed without any news, he began to lose all hope. Then eventually the letter came, instructing him to come for a medical and be ready for training in the use of the apparatus and method used for executions. The only person who knew of Albert's intentions was his mother, and that was a silent understanding. He had no intention of telling anyone. He got some unpaid leave from his other job so he could be in London. 27-year-old Albert made his first trip to London to begin his training. After spending the morning wandering around the sights of London, he arrived at Pentonville Prison. He was directed through the prison by the prison engineer who knew his father and uncle, and Albert became, well, Albert instead of Mr. Pierpoint. He was shown around the execution shed, and as it was the first time he'd actually seen the equipment instead of just reading and hearing about it, he was taken aback a little bit, especially when he stood under the trapdoors and saw the noose, a part of an execution he hasn't really thought about. He and the other trainee, a man somewhat older than him, inspected the apparatus, block chains, levers, bolts, ropes, and mechanisms, everything. They were then shown the condemned cells. That evening he and the other trainee, Sid Collins, took some time to look around London. The next day Albert and Sid met Old Bill, the dummy that was used for training in executions. The first time dropping Old Bill was repeated many times. This was to make sure they got the noose right, and to quote, "Draw it firm and tight with the free end of the rope emerging from the metal eye, just under the left jawbone. There is no knot. That fancy cowboy coil of a hangman's knot is something they abandoned to the Americans 100 years ago." End quote. In Britain, the rope ran free through a pear-shaped metal eye woven into the rope's end, and the operative part of the noose was covered with soft wash leather. It was always adjusted to the left because, with the pull of the drop, the noose gyrated a quarter circle clockwise, and the tug of the rope finished under the chin, through the neck back, and if anybody needs it, a trigger warning, broke the spinal column. If it was adjusted to the right and it gyrated to the back of the neck, throwing the head forward and not broken, the death would be caused by suffocation, which is not good. Quote from Albert Pierrepoint's book. The engineer then went on to instruct them on the procedure. White cap, adjust noose, take out safety pin, push the lever, drop. He went through every detail and showed them how to pinion. They went through the drop calculation, with a reminder to use their own judgment as well as the official drop table that was to be used as a guide. After the lecture, Albert realized the entire execution method is down to following the steps properly, but to use your instincts to work out your own measurements, using the drop table as a guide. He learned about rope stretching and measuring the drop, all the things his father had learned, and Albert's father had been on his mind the moment he walked through those prison gates. That night, Albert sat down and wrote to his Uncle Tom and informed him that he was in the middle of his training to become an executioner. The remaining time was spent repeating the flawless steps to ensure the entire process was done professionally and without any mistake. After giving the final test execution, the prison governor inspected their work, and then, without giving anything away, he told them they were now free to go home. When Albert returned home, a letter was waiting for him from his Uncle Tom, who let him know that he was pleased he had put himself on the list, and he would do all he could if he was to be accepted onto the list to make sure they could work together. Every day he went home and hoped to see that a letter had arrived with those letters on it, OHMS. Weeks later, he received a letter that confirmed he had been placed on the executioner's list. The next hurdle for Albert was to attend his first execution as an observer. This would be the final test of his nerve. But this didn't come for some time. While waiting, he spent some time through the summer with his uncle and his aunt, who gave him some advice and encouragement. His first appointment to officiate was at Armley Jail, Leeds. The prisoner was reprieved. In fact, the next two that followed were also reprieved. Just before Christmas of 1932, his uncle asked for Albert to assist him at an execution at Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. Thomas worked independently for the government of the Irish Free State. They hired Thomas, the top executioner in Great Britain. This was arranged outside of Whitehall. The Irish got to know Thomas and his work very well and decided to make a separate private contract with him. This meant he could choose his own assistant. The day came and Tom arrived to collect Albert. Tom was armed with a revolver in his pocket and explained to Albert he only carried it when he went to Ireland. The two Pierpoints set off for Ireland without any overnight bags. As Thomas said, it makes you stand out, and he tried to look inconspicuous. They bought their tickets for the Holyhead boat train. This trip was quite the eye-opener for Albert in more ways than one. He saw his uncle in a new light. Albert caught a glimpse of his father in his Uncle Thomas as he took a pint and sang. Albert sang along and his uncle laughed. It was a memory Albert would never forget. Arriving at Mountjoy Jail, they inspected the equipment, set the drop and stretched the rope, ate breakfast and slept. On Thursday the 29th of December 1932, Thomas gave Albert some instruction on strapping the prisoner's legs quickly. They ate breakfast and returned to the execution chamber, where Thomas set the drop. He had decided on the night before, and the trapdoors were closed. A few minutes to 8, the two men stood firm outside the condemned cell. Thomas, calm and relaxed, held the arm pinion. In his breast pocket was the folded white cap and the strap in his left hand. At 8 o'clock, an official gave them the signal, and Albert followed his uncle into the cell. It was a short walk to the scaffold, and no sooner had Albert placed the straps around the prisoner's legs and moved back, Thomas had pulled the lever, and it was done. Thomas went into the pit, and the doctor confirmed death. Whisky was offered all round to the witnesses, but Thomas refused for both himself and Albert. The chamber was locked behind them, and they were escorted to their quarters by the prison engineer. Albert reflected on the speed of the whole process while they waited the obligatory hour. Then they returned to the execution chamber to remove the body from the rope and place it in the coffin. Before removing and placing the equipment back in the box, they then left to report to the governor.
That's a portable stairs that was used to allow the executioner and the doctor and possibly the priest to go up to the body after he had come through the trapdoor. Trapdoors are just over my head here. So when the trapdoors flew open and the individual came down the stairs would come the executioner, the doctor and the priest, and that would be shoved over, because there was two members of staff down here also who assisted, and to allow them to go up and to see that the prisoner was deceased. The individual who was to be executed, say the type of Michael Manning in 1954, would have come through that door. You arrive in here, the rope was positioned up here. Everything had been got ready from the night before, because Pierpoint and his assistant arrived at 4 o'clock. Everything was ready. There was the two doors are closed. There's a position marked with a piece of chalk where he wanted them to stand. The piece of chalk marked what they call a letter T. That's the lever that controls the opening of the doors. There's a safety here. When the time was right, and the prisoner's arms were pinned and his legs were pinned and he was standing and there was an officer either side of him, this had to be withdrawn here by the executioner. He then proceeded and he pushed that lever forward. And that's the last sound that the individual would hear. Whatever sounds he heard after that, but that is the last.
There was a nasty crowd outside waiting for them as they left. They didn't like Pierpoint taking the life of Irish men. Thomas calmly sucked on a sweet and walked straight through them, with a tense Albert behind him. They whiled away the rest of the day until the overnight boat came. Thomas fell asleep after telling Albert he had done very well that day. When Albert returned home, he returned to his normal day-to-day job. He wrote to the Home Office telling them he had accompanied his uncle to an execution in Ireland, so wouldn't need to be a second assistant at an execution under observation. But they didn't accept this and preferred to have a prison commissioner personally witness rather than get a report from a Dublin governor. A week or so later, the 1st of February 1932, Albert was asked again to assist at HM Prison, Winson Green in Birmingham, and once again it was with good old Uncle Tom. Robert Wilson was to assist. Albert passed his first observation when Jeremiah Hanbury was hanged. Thomas Pierpoint carried out at least 80% of the hangings in England in 1934, many assisted by his nephew Albert. Albert's first experience of hanging a woman was when Thomas was commissioned to hang Ethel Lillet Major in May 1934, and Albert assisted. When Albert asked Thomas what it was like to hang a woman and if anything differently had to be done, Thomas reassured him. He said she would probably be as calm as any man in that situation. Ethel did not resist and walked bravely to the scaffold. In 1935, Albert received a letter asking him to act as number 1 executioner in Bristol in March for the execution of Reginald Woolmington. But legal history was made when the conviction was squashed in the House of Lords. Albert received the letter informing him his services were no longer required. Albert only had one commission in 1935, assisting his uncle. 1936 would include the execution of nurse Dorothea Waddingham, a Nottingham care home owner convicted of murdering 2 residents for financial gain. Waddingham was found guilty of poisoning Ada Bagley and her mother, Louisa, with morphine, and was subsequently sentenced to death. Waddingham and her partner Joe Sullivan were found to have poisoned the 2 residents after they had changed their wills to leave their estates to Waddingham and Sullivan. Sullivan was acquitted, but Waddingham was convicted for murder. She was hanged by Thomas with Albert assisting at Winson Green Prison. Sullivan later took his own life. After Robert Baxter had to be removed from the executioners list in 1935 due to ill health, he was replaced for a short time by Alfred Allen, who carried out a couple of hangings in 1936 and 1937 before he died. In 1937, the 2 Pierpoints were commissioned to hang Max Mayer Haslam. Haslam murdered Ruth Clarkson, 74, by battering her to death at Clayton Street, Nelson, on the 19th of June 1936. He had also hung her dog from the bedpost. Max Haslam, who was a dwarf, had also stolen her jewellery, and police soon found out that he had been pawning items that they determined to be Ruth Clarkson's. 1937 was quite the year, especially for Thomas. He had taken on more jobs and was now without doubt the country's number 1 chief executioner. And Albert was having quite the year too. He met his future bride, Anne Fletcher, a pretty smart and blonde young woman who had been living with her aunt in Newton Heath. Anne was down to earth and gentle, and Albert liked that very much. It wasn't long before he took her home to meet his family. His mother adored her, and his sister and Anne got on so well. They both joined the nursing reserve as war became more of a reality. Albert was a bit put out at first, as he had just bought his first new car and he wanted to take her out in it, but the training for the nursing reserve and her job at the shop took up most of her time, but he understood why she was doing it. They were happy and made a good match. Tom and his wife gave up the shop and moved just a few miles away to Liggett Green. Albert's job was no different. He became a jack of all trades in selling, driving and taking orders. When the present owner died, the son took over and made Albert manager, with a small rise in his wage. Albert was now 34 and ready to settle down when war raged. Anne and his sister went off to nurse at £1 a week, less their keep. Albert's job in food distribution was classed as essential, and he carried on his travels to prisons across the country. Life just moved on as normal for the Pierpoints, and for the first time in 20 years, Thomas Pierpoint did every single hanging of 1938. He travelled across the country, and Albert assisted at 3 of the executions. Saying that, there were quite a few reprieves that year. Over 2 days at the end of October 1939, Thomas hanged 2 soldiers from the North Staffordshire Regiment for the violation and murder of a young woman near to where they were stationed in Surrey. War had just broken out over Europe a month before. The first Englishman to be hanged for treachery during the war was Newcastle-born spy George Armstrong on July the 9th at Wandsworth Prison by Thomas Pierpoint. An important day for Albert came when he was asked to assist at an execution at Pentonville. But it wasn't his uncle he was to assist this time. Albert was surprised to see it was Sid Collins, the very man he had trained with. Albert was more experienced than Sid, but Sid was older and lived in London, so maybe that's why they chose him. They went through the execution chamber, and a large gathering of officials were there. Nothing unusual. The under-sheriff would inspect the scaffold the day before the execution. Albert noticed Sid looked uncomfortable. It was the first time Sid had been asked to be executioner. He told Albert he didn't know what the drop was. Albert helped him out the entire execution. At the end, Sid wanted Albert to have half his wage, but Albert wouldn't accept it. A whole execution had been observed. Not long after this, around the end of 1940, Albert received a letter from the Prison Commission stating they'd been asked to nominate an assistant as an executioner, and would he wish his name to be put on the list as an executioner. Of course, he replied yes. Albert carried out his first execution as the executioner at Pentonville on October the 31st, 1941. He arrived on October the 30th and was assisted by a new man named Steve Wade. The prisoner was 39-year-old Antonio Babe Mancini, who had killed a man during a fight. The whole process went smoothly and very quickly. When Albert visited the governor before leaving, he said he had watched his uncle many times and was always impressed by him, but he had never seen him carry out an execution as fast as Albert had. The rest of the year was very busy for both Albert and Thomas. One of Albert's most difficult jobs was Karl Richard Richter, a German spy. Richter was captured on the 14th of May 1941 after parachuting into the United Kingdom during the Second World War. He was convicted of espionage at the Old Bailey on the 24th of October 1941 and sentenced to death on the 10th of December 1941 at Wandsworth Prison. On the morning of the execution, Albert moved forward to pinion the prisoner's arms. As he did this, the prisoner made a bolt towards the door. Wade stopped him, and Richter then charged head first at the wall. That dazed him, and for a little while he became more violent, but the hangman grabbed him. As the guards moved in, they managed to pinion his arms behind his back, but Richter struggled as they moved away, and the strap broke. Wade shouted, "He's loose!" The guards finally secured him, and Albert got him strapped up tight. Richter lost it. He threw himself at the wall over and over again, crying out for help. This struggle continued into the execution chamber. Warders had to help him onto the trap. They finally managed to strap his legs. Albert got the noose over his head, but still he struggled. Albert was worried about this. The safety washer that held the noose in place became loose, but the trapdoors had already opened, and the rope swung violently, with those watching looking on in horror. Even with all that, and as gross as it sounds, the execution was clean. Through the war years, the Pierpoints experienced their own heartaches. Albert's sister Ivy had been working tirelessly at the emergency hospital at Wimwick near Warrington, as she helped the boys who came home from Dunkirk. She worked in the operating theatre, doing 18 hours a day. Then one day she collapsed, exhausted. She died not long after. Albert was convinced it was from exhaustion. He was heartbroken, as was his mother, who also passed away about a year later. Albert remained in his home alone and became quite ill with the flu. Anne had been away nursing, but became worried when she hadn't heard from Albert for some time. She found him home and sick in bed. To her surprise, Albert asked her to marry him, and she accepted straight away. And they were married on the 29th of August, 1943, at St. Wilfrid's Church, Newton Heath, and honeymooned in Blackpool. They settled into married life on East Street. Even though those Home Office letters came, Anne never asked or looked at the letters. She didn't question him when he said he had to go away for a few days. When he was commissioned to go to Gibraltar in January 1944 for the execution of 2 saboteurs, the whole process was to be kept secret. Nobody was to be told anything about it. When Albert returned, he told Anne everything about his other job and how many years he had been doing it. He had a feeling she already knew. She told him of all the rumours she had already heard and all the gossip. But over the years they never discussed his experiences, and she never questioned him about any of it. Thomas Pierpoint was getting older and now walked with a stick. He refused to give up the job and was pleased that Albert had managed to get the executioner's fees raised. He knew Albert was getting more work than him, but that didn't bother him. Although Thomas had been busy through December, 1944 would see Thomas Pierpoint's long career as #1 executioner in Great Britain and Ireland come to an end. In August 1944, Tom carried out a double execution at Shepton Mallet when 2 American soldiers who were serving with the Quartermaster Service Company were found guilty of violently violating a young woman on the evening of the 4th of March. They were court-martialed, which was a capital punishable offence. Uncle Tom remained busy through 1945, and it would be in this year that Albert would only assist his uncle once. The Pierpoint name was to become an extremely well-known name to the British public and beyond, when at the end of the war, the treason trials were to start. Each tribunal and sentence was spaced out, and Albert was commissioned to fly to Germany to execute the man they called the Beast of Belsen. And if found guilty, the other staff of Belsen were also to be hanged. Back home, attention was brought to Albert's name from Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters in Germany, who announced that Albert Pierpoint was to be the executioner of the staff of Belsen prison camp. The announcement brought incredible publicity. Albert was chased by the press as he tried to reach his plane to fly to Germany. Reporters even waited on his doorstep, hoping to get a photo. Albert had lived by the rules he had learned when a young man starting out. Avoid public attention. General behaviour must be respectable and discreet. He didn't like all this attention. Well, not much. Albert landed in Germany on Tuesday 11th of December and drove through Hamelin to a jail in Westphalia. He was met by a group of British Army officials and some who had been seconded from HM prison services. There was a lengthy discussion, and Albert learned he was to hang 13 prisoners in one day, 11 from Belsen, and 2 had been sentenced to death by the War Crimes Commission. Albert had 32 hours to carefully plan and prepare this historic execution. On December the 12th, Albert woke up and went to find the execution site. He met his assistant, RSM O'Neill, and he took him directly there. Together they explored the prison. O'Neill would assist Albert at around 200 executions of war criminals in Germany. The execution chamber had just been finished, built by the Royal Engineers. It was at the end of a wing and at the right side of a long corridor, adjoining the smallest condemned cells Albert had ever seen. As he walked down, he saw for the first time Joseph Kramer, the former commandant, also known as the Beast of Belsen. Outside, Albert could hear the obvious scraping and digging sounds of the 13 graves being dug. Inside the chamber, they began preparations and tested the gallows. After lunch, Albert had a new experience. He had to go through the ordeal of measuring and weighing all the prisoners, including some other details such as religion and age. Kramer was first, and Albert noted he was a defiant man and big in stature. O'Neill took his details. Next was Dr. Fritz Klein, the man who had sent people to the gas chambers. He made the decisions on who was healthy enough to work at specific jobs or die. Once the 10 men had been dealt with, it was the time for the women. 21-year-old Irma Gress laughed as she stood before the men asking her questions. She answered abruptly but without any problem. This young woman had a whip and was said to be responsible for the deaths of at least 30 people a day with that very whip. Another side of her came out when she was told to step on the scales. "Schnell," she shouted. "Get on with it." Elizabeth Volkenrath was next. She too was one who picked out who went to the gas chamber. She was a cold-looking woman, and it was said feared by many in the camp. She was, according to some accounts, the most hated woman. 42-year-old Joanna Borman, the woman with the wolfhounds, who, it was said, would let the hounds loose and set them on the prisoners to rip them apart. She was last. Returning to his room, Albert spent hours working out the precise measurements he would need for each prisoner. Back in the execution chamber, he and O'Neill went through rehearsals after rehearsal, making sure everything was set. On Friday the 13th of December 1945, Albert, O'Neill and an officer made their way to the prison. The witnesses arrived, and Brigadier Patton Walsh, the British officer in charge of the execution, arrived. Albert knew him as the former Deputy Governor of Wandsworth Prison. Also attending, because women were to be hanged, was Miss Wilson, Deputy Governor of Manchester. As the hour grew near, the group proceeded to the execution chamber, walking past the condemned cells. The brigadier looked at his watch and gave Albert the signal. Albert called out to the first woman, Irma Gress. He pinioned her arms, and she stepped into the chamber, glanced around, and walked onto the trap. Albert placed the white cap over her head. As she shouted, "Schnell!" he pulled the lever, and she fell into the pit. After about 30 minutes, the body was removed, and it was the turn of Valkenrath, and then Borman. After a short break, the scaffold was set for the double executions, and first up was the beast of Belsen, Kramer, and Klein. Their execution went without a hitch, as did the rest. The bodies were placed in coffins, but all except one, who was wrapped in hessian and taken for burial outside. The whole process was over by 1 o'clock. When Albert Pierrepoint returned to London the next day, he was treated like a celebrity. He would return to Germany on many occasions as the only British executioner called on, and sometimes in very difficult conditions. Between 1945 and 1949, he performed 200 executions of people who were convicted of war crimes, including 2 British soldiers convicted of murder. Albert didn't do the Nuremberg executions. The trials were carried out mainly by the Americans, and the executions were carried out by an American sergeant. They had their own rules and ways on how they were carried out, so Albert stayed home. In 1946, Albert and Anne took over the pub, Help the Poor Struggler, at Hollingwood between Oldham and Manchester. This suited the Pierpoints to the ground. Anne loved it, and Albert could carry out his other job without worrying about letting anyone down. It was working for himself. It was ideal. It was a friendly Lancashire pub with lots of singing around the piano. Thomas would join them whenever he could, and it gave Albert joy to see him. But it was now time for Thomas to retire, and in 1946 he was finally taken off the list, and just like his brother, he wasn't told anything. Thomas Pierpoint had remained as executioner for 40 years, from 1906 to 1946, assisted at 35 executions and carried out 203 civilian hangings in England and Wales and 4 in Scotland. Thomas was the official executioner for the Irish Republic after it gained independence from England in 1923 and carried out 27 executions at Dublin's Mountjoy prison. Over the years, Albert became friends with many of the police, one being Bob Fabian, famous for Fabian of the Yard. He also became good friends with Chief of Scotland Yard's Flying Squad and Reg Spooner. While the Nuremberg executions were ongoing, Albert hanged Neville Heath at Pentonville. Post-war brought John George Hay face to face with Albert. Of course, Albert had followed the news about this man's crimes and had his own thoughts and feelings on the matter. I think this execution was a satisfying one for him. One personal moment that surprised him was when a regular who came to the Struggler on a Saturday night with a woman turned out to be a customer at his other job. Apparently, Albert had never known the man's real name, but the man always greeted him with "Hello, Tosh," and Albert replied, "Hello, Tish." It was a common saying back then. He was a good singer and the life and soul of the party. Everyone seemed to like him. As soon as he got his pint, he would start singing, and Albert would often join him. He always had the same woman with him, and everyone thought she was his wife. She wasn't. But he was an extremely jealous man. One Saturday night, after saying good night to Tosh, and Albert replied good night Tish, something happened between the man and the woman, and the woman was found dead in a hotel with the word whore written across her forehead. The man was caught and sentenced to death. It wasn't until Albert went to see the man in the condemned cell that he suddenly realised who it was. The next morning, when Albert went to get the prisoner looked at him and said, "Hello, Tosh." And Albert replied, "Hello, Tish." Times were changing, especially in regards to the death penalty. In May 1949, the Royal Committee sat for the first time to consider and report whether liability under the criminal law in Great Britain to suffer capital punishment for murder should be limited or modified, and if so, to what extent and by what means. For how long and under what conditions persons who would otherwise have been liable to suffer capital punishment should be detained. Albert would be called to give evidence in 1950. He gave a factual account of the execution process from the perspective of the chief executioner. He presented the act of hanging as a solemn, precise and humane procedure, carried out without emotion, as a duty to the state.
My name is Albert Pierrepoint, and I was executioner for 25 years. Here are a few notes on what happens when a man is to be executed. When a man is to be executed, I and my assistant must get to the prison by 4 o'clock on the day before the execution. And we have to stay there until it is over. We are told the height and weight of the prisoner and are given an opportunity to see him at exercise or in his cell or from some point where he cannot see us. Having got the idea of his physique, we can make the proper preparation for his execution. The execution chamber is usually next door to the condemned cell. It is a small room with a trap in the centre of the floor. The bag is filled with sand and we rehearse the drop to see that it's all in order. The prisoner is out of his cell while we are doing this, so that he does not hear the noise of what we are doing. We leave the bag hanging to stretch the rope overnight and go off to our room to wait until next morning. When it is time for the execution, we make a final check of the equipment. Then we wait outside the condemned cell for the signal of the sheriff to go in. I used to arrange that the prisoner has his back to us when I come in case he might get excited. Then when I am inside, I fasten his arms behind his back with a leather strap. Then the prisoner is escorted out of the condemned cell into the execution chamber and is placed on a white chalk mark so that his feet are across the division of the trap. While my assistant is fastening up his legs, I draw a white cap over his head and place a noose round his neck. The knot is a secret of it. We have to put it on the left lower jaw, and if we have it on the side, when he falls, it finishes underneath the chin and throws the chin back. But if the knot is on the right-hand side, it would finish up behind his neck and throw his neck forward, which would be strangulation. He might live on the rope for a quarter of an hour then, As soon as I see that everything is ready, I pull the lever and the prisoner falls through it, and it is all over in an instant.
But that's just a shortened version of it. Of course, there's so much more to it. Albert was extremely interested to see the results from the Royal Commission and read it from start to finish. He had his own thoughts on some of the issues raised, but it did make Albert think about the future. But in between this time, Albert had been called on quite a few times. On March the 9th, 1950, at HMP Pentonville, Albert and his assistant, Sid Durnley, were assigned to hang Timothy John Evans. Albert knew the case well. He had read the news and formed his own opinions. Evans was terrified as he walked to the execution chamber. Albert carried out the execution swiftly to minimize his suffering. Through the whole of 1950, the hangings continued across the country, including his friend James Henry Corbett, aka Tish. In June 1952, Albert and Anne left to help the poor struggler and took over a new pub, the Rose and Crown, in Hoole near Preston. Albert was still well known, which he claimed made him uneasy, but he used it to his advantage and it filled his pub. However, the debate about abolishing the death penalty was gaining traction. In January 1953, Albert had to hang Derek Bentley. This was a hugely controversial case, and Albert knew it. There was widespread public protest going on. Bentley, who had a low mental age, was hanged for the murder of police officer Sidney Miles. Despite the fatal shot being fired by his accomplice, Christopher Craig, who was too young to be executed, the let him have it Chris phrase was central to the legal interpretation. Bentley's execution sparked widespread public protest and calls for abolition. While Pierpoint was simply doing his job, the immense public outcry about this specific execution put the institution of hanging and, by extension, its chief practitioner under intense scrutiny. The news during this period was dominated by the legal and moral arguments surrounding the Bentley case, indirectly reflecting on Pierpoint's role. In February 1953, Albert and Harry Smith hanged Giffard. In July 1953, it was John Christie's turn. Albert removed Christie's glasses from his sneering face. He remembered the small man moving slowly and shakily towards the chamber. Christie barely reached the T on the trapdoor. Albert slipped on the white cap and quickly pulled the lever. John Christie dropped to his death. As Albert hanged Christie, he thought about Timothy Evans. Albert visited his uncle whenever he could. His aunt had passed away long ago, and now his uncle was crippled with arthritis and bedridden. During this last visit to his beloved Uncle Thomas, Albert had the chance to say goodbye. Thomas died on February 11th, 1954, at his daughter's home in Bradford. He was 84 years old. 28-year-old club hostess Ruth Ellis was charged with the murder of her boyfriend David Blakely. She was sentenced to death. Her execution was set for 9 a.m. on July the 13th, 1955. The day before, the crowds had started to gather outside the prison, and Albert and his assistant could hear them below the windows. The prison governor called for the police assistance as the crowd grew around the gates, singing hymns and protesting. This was becoming a familiar sight for Albert and the other executioners, Albert being the most recognisable for obvious reasons. Albert and Ellis continued to do their job. Then 5 minutes before the execution was due to begin, a phone call came in, claiming to be from the Home Secretary's office that delayed the execution. The caller claimed that a stay of execution had been granted and to wait for further instructions. The governor called the Home Office straight away and advised no such action had been taken, and the execution went ahead. The crowd fell silent. Back at the Rose and Crown, it was packed with those who wanted to see the hangman. Albert had been considering his and Anne's future for some time, and with the way things were going, he knew that change was coming. He wasn't worried about it. He had plans of his own. More and more reprieves were being given, but Albert was still doing some executions, and on Monday the 2nd of January 1956, Albert set out for Manchester on what was supposed to be a double execution, turned into a single one. When he reached Manchester, he met with Harry Allen. Before going to see the prisoner, after checking the equipment and going to their quarters for their evening meal, while still eating, they were interrupted and told that the prisoner had been spared by a reprieve. Albert and Harry put the equipment away and left. Albert wasn't happy and decided, because of the weather, to stay the night at a hotel. Once home, Albert spent some time thinking about what he was going to do moving forward and came to the decision to resign. He wrote to the prison commissioners on the 25th of January 1956. Dear Sir, I was engaged by the Under-Sheriff of Lancashire to carry out an execution of T. Bancroft at HMP Prison, Manchester, on the 3rd of January last. I reported for duty in the usual way. Later in the evening I was informed that Bancroft had been respited. I left the prison at about 8:30, and as it was a very bad evening, I had to stay overnight in Manchester. Also on leaving, I had to engage extra staff to look after my business during my absence. On returning home, I was only paid my out-of-pocket travelling expenses. The Under-Sheriff informs me he has no ruling in the matter of paying fees in this particular case. I feel sure after making all the necessary arrangements and reporting for duty I was entitled to my full fees, which has been granted to me on other occasions. I would be much obliged if you would give me a ruling concerning this matter. Your obedient servant, A. Pierpoint. The commissioners wrote back reminding Albert of the rules, basically being, and to quote, paid by the neck. Albert acknowledged the reply that he had received a cheque for £4, which they thought was enough to compensate him for his attendance at HMP Manchester. He informed them that he thought it wasn't adequate, especially after his long service with them and his extensive experience. He felt in these circumstances that he had made up his mind to resign, and his letter was to be accepted as his letter of resignation, and requested his name be removed from the list of executioners. The letter was dated the 23rd of February 1956. The press got hold of the information. It was all over the news. Pierpoint resigned. Many thought it was because of the payment disagreement, but it wasn't. Albert knew the way the world was changing, and he'd got himself a nice deal with the Sunday Chronicle and Empire News to do a series of articles about the cases he had worked on. It was going to be an expose about the last moments of some of the well-known cases, and he had been paid very well indeed. When the Home Office found out, they were upset and wrote to Albert reminding him of the agreement he had made when taking the executioner's job. Albert admitted it was true, but said he wasn't sharing anything that wasn't already public. They asked him to send his work before it was published, so they could remove anything they thought inappropriate. Albert, it seems, ignored their request, and the series began on Sunday the 18th of March. Despite initial resistance, the Home Office applied considerable pressure on the newspaper publishers. As a result, the Empire News was forced to heavily redact the articles. For Pierpoint, it meant that his attempt to publicly share his experiences in detail was curtailed, and it highlighted the sensitive nature of his former profession. Ultimately, the Empire News announced that, in view of the difficulties, it decided to cancel the series. The government decided against prosecuting Pierpoint under the Official Secrets Act, likely concluding it would be counterproductive. Anne and Albert went on holiday, got home and carried on. He ran his pub and bought a pony he named Trio. The years after his retirement in the post-abolition era, Pierpoint became a unique link to the practice of hanging. He reportedly dispensed expertise about hanging for television and radio audiences and acted as a film consultant. This allowed him to maintain some public presence, albeit in a different capacity. He also made videos on the process he used to carry out his duties as executioner. When Executioner Pierpoint was finally published in book form in 1974, it was his definitive account of his life and career as Britain's chief executioner. The book covered his family history in the trade, his training and early years as an assistant, his career as chief executioner. This was the core of the book, where he provided accounts of many of the notable executions he had carried out. The mechanics of hanging, he described the long drop method designed for instant death, the importance of the table drops for the calculating of the rope length based on the prisoner's weight and build, and the overall procedure of the execution chamber. His personal reflections and evolving views. This was arguably the most important part of the book. After years of maintaining a professional and detached demeanour, Pierpoint used his autobiography to reveal his personal conclusion that capital punishment was ultimately not a deterrent to murder. He famously stated that all the men and women whom I have faced at that final moment convinced me that in what I have done, I have not prevented a single murder. Capital punishment, in my view, achieved nothing except revenge. This powerful statement from such a central figure in the history of British capital punishment became a significant contribution to the ongoing debate, especially as the death penalty had been suspended in 1965 and was facing a vote for permanent abolition. Sometime in the 1960s, Albert and Anne left the Rose and Crown and moved to a bungalow in Southport. As they grew older, they both fell ill at the same time and were admitted to the hospital together. While they were being treated, their home was broken into. Because of this, they decided to move into Melvin Nursing Home in Southport. Albert had sold all of his papers, his memoirs, his diaries, to a former neighbour who put them up for auction in 1992. He sold all of the photos to papers, and the entries from his diaries became public. The diary was also sold, as was Henry Pierpoint's diary. As far as we know, Thomas didn't keep a diary. It was hoped that Albert didn't hear of this, as it would have been upsetting for him. Albert Pierpoint died on the 10th of July 1992. He was 87. Anne passed away in 1998. She was 93 years old. Love him or hate him, Albert Pierpoint was Britain's most famous executioner. The Pierpoints made a lasting impact on the history of criminology. Henry Pierpoint executed 105. Thomas Pierpoint 294. Albert Pierpoint 435. Thank you for watching or listening.